Good afternoon and welcome back, and I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. So we're going to continue the discussion that we had before lunch on small-scale irrigation. Before lunch, we looked at the financing, which is a very important part of the ecosystem. But we know that it's actually policy that can drive those changes that we spoke about. We heard earlier from Murray about the importance of smallholder irrigation to helping smallholder farmers develop that third crop to bring in those crops for food security. And what we're seeing now is that policy can be critical as well. We heard a little bit about incentives this morning, but what we want to do is what is needed to drive the innovation that we know is going to be so critical. What are the information or economic or regulatory policy drivers that can bring about that change that we were looking at? My name is Rachel McDonnell, and I'm the Deputy Director General at the International Water Management Institute, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session this afternoon. Joining me are a series of panelists who are going to give insight on particular three parts of the policy that are going to influence this small-scale irrigation. And then we'll also have some videos as well to bring additional insight. So we have Murray Agbonlaha from the African Union Commission. We have Alok Sika from the International Water Management Institute and Chair of Irrigation Efficiency Task Force of the Indian government. We have Bedru Balana from the International Food Policy Research Institute, Biniam Eyob from USAID, and it's going to be a little bit of a dance coming up and down to the stage here. We'll also have Jude Cobbings from Save the Children joining us, Richard Birkland from Valmont, and Nicole Lafore from Texas A&M and the Innovation Lab for small-scale irrigation. And then the pumps we'll have from for the videos will be from Future Pump and from Wendy Jepson. So our first part of this session, we're going to look at policies that support smallholder irrigation. And we're going to ask for 2-minute brief remarks from our panelists, and then we will have turn to some questions. So Murray, I'm going to ask you first to give your 2 minutes of remarks.
Thank you very much, McDonald. Yeah. So good afternoon, and I hope we're all back from lunch and refreshed. Thanks a lot. And on the issue of policy, I think this is key. This is what we do at the African Union Commission. At the African Union Commission, it's a continental organization. We don't have projects in member states. Our main task is policy advocacy and also supporting capacity building where necessary. But it is very germane at this point to really look at what is policy, because we should know that policy is not just rhetoric. Politics is not just a comment made by the head of state or the president somewhere. Policies are guidelines that should have strong institutional backings so that they can really be implemented. Now, in terms of policy that are necessary to support farmer-led irrigation or small-scale irrigation, policy that has to do with the market is key. Policy that has to do with access to productive resources, not just to irrigation facilities, but also to fertilizer, to agrochemicals. So these are key. Then also we have to look at infrastructure. In the morning session, we're talking about reducing transaction costs. Investment in infrastructure, road access to software infrastructure, so that energy will go a long way in reducing transaction costs. So for policy that will really strengthen small-scale irrigation uptake in the continent, we are looking at policies that influence the market, policies that influence the players, policies that influence finance. These are key, and I've also talked about the issue of having strong institutions that will enable implementation of whatever is put forward. The other aspect I want to talk about when we're talking about policy here is now the issue of land access that was also discussed in the morning. There's a need for strong policy prescription on access to land, access to water resources. If these are not put in place, it will eventually erode all that the gains that have been made. So irrigation should be taken or food production should be taken as a package. Once you are planning for irrigation development, you must bring in the other elements in terms of access to market, access to productive resources, and the enabling environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray, bringing in a really important insight from Africa. And yes, it is about policies and institutions for driving that change. So, Alok, can you give us insight from Asia, please?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Yes, as we know that the Asia is got about 41% of the cultivated land under irrigation. That's the largest the world over, and thanks to, of course, the policy planning and the programs of the various governments in various countries of Asia, and as a result that it has really led to a good amount of green revolution. So that's because besides the hybrid seeds and the fertilizer, I think water was one of the major input providing irrigation, so it has really served that kind of a purpose. And at the same time, what's happening also is that, particularly if I talk about China and India, they themselves, these two countries contribute to about 42% of the irrigated area in the entire Asia. And over the years, although these things have been doing good job, and over the years, what has been happening is that the neglect of large and medium irrigation projects, because of the aging of the infrastructures and many other poor operation and maintenance, the funds for operation and maintenance, that has been given away. And then again, the new policies of the government to promote groundwater, pumping technology. So that has taken over the canal irrigation, and you will see that over the past 4 decades, hardly anything has been added to irrigation from the canal irrigation, but it has mostly come from groundwater. And if you try and look into the entire South Asia, the same in the picture, like over 60% of irrigated agriculture is from groundwater. And so that's where the smallholders are also pretty much into the picture. Now, what has been happening over the successive governments and the successive plannings, that once this thing has been going down the road, very recently, about a couple of years back, the government of India came up with something called Prime Minister's Irrigation Scheme, means water for each and every farmer's field. Of course, it was a very far-sighted effort. It is still going on. And then from IMI, we have also done the policy analysis of that. And we have also come up with that there are certain low-hanging fruits. If you really want to achieve that, you have to see that there are unexploited resources which are available. So we came up with some things which the government of India has taken it forward as a PMKSY groundwater component. So that's kind of a way that you can support the type 2 irrigation system, what we call, which are not the large and the medium irrigation, but the minor irrigation systems, both the surface as well as the subsurface. Likewise, there are now the thinking about a lot of impetus is being given to the clean energy. So the solar irrigation is catching up in those areas. So we also have come up, I think, in the next round on the groundwater, I'll be talking more about that where there have been a number of ways that you try and look into the policy. The government has a policy of solarizing agriculture. And then there was another policy which really is based on the IMI's work, which we have been trying to look into, that how you can have a different set of policies in the water surplus areas and water starved areas or the water deficit areas. So we have also come up, and now the government has also internalized that in a policy of the KUSUM, what they call in the solar energy, that how best you can have on-grid and off-grid system of this thing, so that in one area. So those are the number of the policies that which we have been talking about. I think going forward, I'll be able to explain and touch more upon that. So at this point of time, I think I'll leave it over here. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you, Alok, and thank you for highlighting the influence of policies beyond water and energy, but also the different policies across a country and with it beyond countries, the influence that could have. Bedru, we know that economic instruments and tariffs can be very important. Can you give us some insight from Ethiopia, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think before I go to Ethiopia, let me just briefly mention the importance of policy in driving actions. I think if I borrow your words, policy actually drives actions. And in IFRI, at the Internal Food Policy Research Institute, we are very, very much interested in policy. And I think from the discussions we have in the last few days, it's clear that the challenges of climate change, the challenges of food insecurity, nutrition issues, environmental degradation, and so on are clear. And now, when you come to the constraints of the irrigation technologies, it's scaling and then adoption of these technologies across, scale. One of the constraints can be a kind of enabling environment which can actually motivate farmers, which can incentivize farmers to invest in agricultural technologies, including irrigation. So the finance, technical issues, governance and other things can also be a constraint. So I think in this afternoon we'll focus on more on policy constraints and how policy is important in driving a set of actions. So in my later talk, I will come to give some specific examples in Ethiopia where the Ethiopian government adopted some specific policy on importation of agricultural mechanization machineries and irrigation technologies and so on. So whether that policy change in importing these technologies, can that really make a difference in terms of scaling the technologies across the smaller farmers, which we'll discuss a little bit later now. But I think the point is policy is one key area that can drive the technology adoption and increase productivity and all sorts of challenges we have. If we have a good policy, we can actually mitigate some of the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Bedring. And yes, trade policy is equally as important as to be able to support smallholder farmers. Access, we heard this morning about access to equipment, to access to good quality equipment, so that is going to justify investment. So Biniam, can we ask you about large and small scale irrigation and donor investments, please?
Sure, I'll do my best. Thank you for inviting me to this, to contribute thoughts on this environment, very important topic. I'll start, of course, when you talk about policy, since I'm in the policy division now. We have, again, similar to the financing event that we had, we have a guidance on global food security strategy. We have a guidance on programming approach for policy systems from 2022 to 2026. So you can look at that more. Some of the things we can think about, if I were to shorten that guidance, it would be on three aspects. We want to have what we call three stools. Everything, there's always three stools, right, of policy or anything. So we look at it like, do we have the same, do we have an agreed policy agenda? Second thing to look at it is that, do we have strong institutional architecture, which actually Mark has mentioned is one of the biggest issues we have in the water, according to his presentation that you see. Third is, do we have accountability, what we call mutual accountability? So the best example that we have on this from the policy division that we have is the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Plan, where all the African government have decided to put a certain amount of funding, right? They had the same policy agenda. They have institutional architecture mechanisms where countries such as Rwanda and others actually do get into achieving them. And then they had mutual accountability, where every 2 years through the biannual joint sector review, they come and are they making progress or not? So this is something that we can think of from the water sector, from that area. So irrigation, along with many other farming technologies, as you know, can contribute significantly to the reduction in poverty and economic growth in a sustainable manner. And if you look at the World Bank, there's a lot of resource where they say irrigation, on average, at least twice as productive per unit of land as rain-fed agriculture. Thereby, it can allow for more production intensification and actually crop diversification, which is very important. In terms of the large versus small scale, that question that you asked, actually, we had a May 24th event that IFPRI and USAID was the main POC for it. We organized an event, Irrigation Fit to Scale. It's online if you want to look at it at the IFPRI event, where we actually invited people from IUMI, IFPRI, where the main lead, of course, we have Peter from the director of the Dorothy, the Water Institute here. We had USDA, we have MCC, CAI, and others actually talking about what are the commonalities, what are the where are the commonality between small scale, large scale, and medium kind of irrigation. And that's actually what Murray presented in the previous presentation that you saw, Irrigation Fit for Scale, which I'm the co-author along with him and others, where we try to see where are the commonalities we want to see. Where is the next step? Because whether we like it or not, when I talk to many implementers, such as Nicole here with the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for small scale irrigation, small scale, large scale, it's already moving from they are already going. Small scale, they're going to buy the pumps. Governments are going to do the funds. We as a donor, we just are contributing a little bit because most of it will be done by the countries, by the private sector, through loans and grants. So the idea from policy is how do we make sure that all these investments are not going to cause environmental issues, are not going to neglect women and minorities, and actually are not going to put the farmers themselves at an economic situation where they won't be able to make money because they'll just get all the resources and they might actually be destitute. So they will be worse off than they were. So from a policy action, what can we do? And again, coming back to Mark's presentation, how do we create an institutional architecture, good policy to actually make this happen? So I think I'm going to stop there and here to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Biniam, and getting us to think big, small investment and the role of the private sector and investment for delivering on those policy agendas, I think is really critical. So I'm now going to ask the panelists a question. So Murray, if I could ask you first, how can policy provide support for smallholders in Africa who want to start or increase irrigation, and in particular, poorer women and men farmers?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I will focus on policy that encourage private sector participation. Farming is a business and it has to be taken that way. What we see in Africa is that in some countries in Africa, government is in everything, even in side events, and it's not supposed to be so. So policy that open up the space for private sector participation will definitely promote smallholder irrigation. Then we also talked about the infrastructure. This is where the private sector may not want to invest in terms of road, access roads, and maybe soft infrastructure like telecommunications. So if policies are rural development policies that encourages development of this infrastructure will also boost smallholder irrigation. If the situation is okay, if in terms of the environment is conducive, the farmers will invest. The farmers will go in. I say farmers are risk averse, but they are not profit averse. So if there is element of profits and they see it, they can invest in water infrastructure. Thank you.
So stability and security in that environment, in that policy environment, and encouraging farmers, and they feel safe to invest and safe to take out those loans. Alok, can I ask you about, and we heard about it this morning, what can we learn from India and Asia? We know that the continent and the country is advanced in this, and what can you tell us about in terms of supportive policies, or maybe even things not to do?
All right. Not to do are so many. So yeah, there are like supporting policies, right from the beginning we have had so many coming from the, as I said, large and medium irrigation sectors, and then moving on to more bringing the community participation in terms of the participatory approach. So I think we have had a good amount of learning also from the participatory irrigation management. And there I think one of the lessons which at least I can share about is that it's just not good to have only the community participation in the form of what is the associations or the federations, but what our experience has shown is that we have to go beyond that. That how you kind of link this what is the associations with the kind of a supporting practices and other supports which goes beyond this thing to how best the water can be used, say for best agricultural practices or the inputs. So that's kind of an example, and that's really has proved very good in one of the projects which has been supported by World Bank and which we have been evaluating in the West Bengal Minor Irrigation Development Project. That you see many places the water user associations and the PIM, but that is how, unless you try and link them with the kind of good support services to bridge the gap, you really cannot make the water which has been provided have more value addition and bringing more. So that's one of the kind of the lessons that I think which is more in a positive direction, that again the policies are there both for water abundant areas and water stressed areas. Like we have been talking about in the western part of the country where there are a lot of groundwater stress areas are there. Then we have been talking about the policy instruments like delaying the date of rice transplanting. So that's the kind of the peak period when evapotranspiration is very high, and so there is a more withdrawal of groundwater. So that's kind of a thinking that, and that as a policy instrument by the government has really acted well in terms of reducing the drawdown and reducing the water level. At the same time, we cannot have the same policy throughout the country, because in eastern part of the country where water is surplus, there are different kind of a policy instruments like which are going to encourage bringing more irrigation under the crop under irrigation. So there was something called bringing green revolution to eastern India, wherein you try and support that water availability is there, but water accessibility is not there. So there is no physical scarcity of water, but economic scarcity of water is there. So there you try and give them the support in trying to see that how best at the local level the water resources can be developed. So that's kind of another way of that you are trying to incentivize the farmers. The other thing which really has been happening, as I was talking to you, that now the crop diversification. Now there are areas where the government is now come up with the number of schemes and the programs where people are being incentivized to diversify the crop, say away from rice in certain part of the areas, particularly in the groundwater starved areas. So so what I would think is that there are lessons which perhaps could be learned, and also that in India we have the free electricity in majority of the, not in all the states, but quite a few of the states, and maybe at the time it was perhaps required that to have the food security issues and then go on giving minimum support price for the crop and give the free electricity, because we wanted to have a more food surplus. But now with the time the things have been changing, so now we are trying to see that how best we can put a curve on that. So the lesson which I feel is that we have to have in a more balanced way in trying to see that this kind of a freebies culture should be kind of starved or checked, and that is something that I would like to say. And rather than subsidization, go for incentivization. Maybe when we come to the groundwater sector, I'll talk more about that. I'll leave it over.
Thank you, Alok. So policy design, policy implementation, and then some of those instruments that might seem like a good idea, like free electricity, actually then turns out not to be, and drives policy outcomes that were not necessarily part of that early policy design. So, Bedru, I'd like to ask you can you describe the policies that the Ethiopian government has put in place to support smallholder farmers in irrigation, and any gaps or opportunities that you have seen?
Yeah, thank you. Let me start with just a little bit of background on the situation in Ethiopia before I go to the specific tariff policy in irrigation equipment. Ethiopia is a large country in terms of population, over 120 million population, the second populous country in the continent, and the characteristics of agriculture in terms of GDP, employment, and the export, it's I think almost the same trend with other African countries. So I don't go for numbers on that. Again, in terms of the water potential, like I mentioned this also in yesterday's comment, that I think people who do not know Ethiopia, when we hear about the droughts in Ethiopia and sometimes the kind of food insecurity issues. Even some of my colleagues from African colleagues mentioned that Ethiopia is just like a desert or dry country and no water and things like that. And that's actually not true. And of course, Ethiopia is actually even considered to be a water tower for the continent. We have estimates from IMI, for example, over up to 6.5 billion cubic meters of groundwater potential. We have 12 big river basins, including the mighty Nile. You know, Nile is the longest river in the world. And, you know, if you look at the contribution of Nile water, Ethiopia contributes over 80% of that Nile water, and we have so many other water potentials. Now, having this background, actually, so it's a bit sometimes like a paradox that why we suffer with food security, having all this land and water resources. So that's where the policy aspect, come in. And so now from almost like 5-6 years ago, there was quite a lot of conversation on how to promote small-scale irrigation and general irrigated farming in Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian government, I think after quite a lot of consultation, took a decision to make a duty-free or duty exemption of irrigation technologies, not just only irrigation technologies, but also the agricultural machineries and even livestock production technologies. This is a very grand policy where you completely remove all the taxes and the duties, import duties from this equipment and the machineries, which was introduced in 2019. So it's very detailed list. Like, for example, I look at the document and there are over 110 lists of irrigation equipments, including drilling machines, tubes, pipes, water pumping machines, solar panels, drip irrigation kits, sprinkler irrigation kits, and all sorts of, so the list is very long. And so all these equipments are exempted free. So companies who are licensed to import these items, these technologies can import. Of course, they have to go all the administration process to do that. Even private investors can also import these technologies. So this is a huge chunk of removing the cost. Like, I think in the document I see the tariff goes up to 47% of the value of the import. So if you just take that out, it can significantly reduce the cost of these machines. So in terms of policy, I think this is a very good policy. And one thing that we haven't assessed so far is what's the impact of these policies, whether the irrigation equipment importation increased significantly after this policy adoption, or whether there is a huge scale in terms of adopting these technologies by smallholder farmers. There are some anecdotal information, qualitative studies, focus groups, key informant interviews, and so on, that actually indicate the positive directions. But in terms of the quantitative numbers, how much the farmers' income increased because of this thing, or how much, the poverty level reduced, or how much the food security level reduced because of this. So if we is trying to do some work on that, it's just it's progressing, we are working on that. But overall, I think there is a positive signal on that in terms of all these different indicators. So that's one aspect of the policy. But I think in Ethiopia there is also another component, which is an institutional capacity building. Who will implement this policy and other policy? Implementation issue is another key area where we have now the Ministry of Irrigation and Lowlands, which was used to be within the Ministry of Agriculture before. Now in 2021, the government created a new ministry, which now is labeled as Ministry of Irrigation and the Lowlands. Lowlands are actually, more prone to drought, so that it includes this small-scale irrigation. And then we have also the Agriculture Transformation Agency that the government created. We have, so many institutional capacity building is on there. And one last point, again linked to the policy, is the the extension agents. I think in many countries, extension agents is important, and the extension agent ratio now is 1 to a little bit under for 500 farmers. So in effect, 1 extension agent to 500 farmers, which is, I think, a very good number, because I work in many other African countries. It goes up to even 1 to like 10,000 or in thousands in other. So this is a significant investment that the government did in the last couple of years, maybe in 2 decades almost. So I think that there is no much in extension. So if you go farming communities, small scale farmers, you see extension agents are just around to advise governments, whether it's irrigation or seed utilization and other things. So the last point in terms of the gap is the complementarity of irrigation with other technologies and other policies. I think as I heard this talk with other colleagues on seed, for example, because with irrigation you need more improved seeds, probably more fertilizer, for example. You need more knowledge how to use, technical capacity and so on. So I think those areas are something that we need to capitalize on this duty-free exemption of these different irrigation technologies. I wouldn't say, like, there are a lot of talk on subsidy, and now in many people, especially economists, significantly in many places say subsidy is always wrong. I think all subsidies are not bad. We shouldn't condemn every single subsidy, because if you look at agriculture as a common good, as a public good, then actually it's an investment to get public good. Let's take the Common Agricultural Policy, which was established almost 6 decades ago in EU. And now, so what was the main content of the CAP? It's actually subsidy. You subsidize because agriculture is a public good, right? So I don't know in US, but I think all subsidies are not bad. Now the thing is how we design that subsidy to create better public goods, if you consider agriculture as public good, including the environment, right? So that's just my comment, and I'll come back if any question later.
Thank you, Bedouin. Lots for us to think about there, whether it's learning from Ethiopia, whether it's duty-free importing of equipment to support it, or expanded extension, or maybe that contentious area of subsidies. And I'm not sure that the EU's Common Agricultural Policy is a great idea, but maybe we can learn from some of the mistakes from that. Biniam, can you tell us the role of donors such as USAID in supporting smallholder irrigation?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to approach this question in about three parts, if that's okay. So the first part is again, I'm always going to go to guidance again, to the global food security guidance we have on improved water resource management for agricultural systems. So if I were to summarize that guidance, I would put it into 3 different sections, where one of the things is, how do we help support governance and institutions, including policy frameworks such as institutional architecture, or having a commonality of policy agenda that are agreed among stakeholders, farmers, private sector, and everything else. The second thing I would think about is that, think about it from all the technological assessments, on-farm water management to sustainable irrigation. How do we make sure that the water is in terms of quantity, quality, timing, accessibility, and everything is managed very well. So we want to do that from that kind of a guidance, if you look at it. And then, last but not least, please let's always make sure that we have our eyes on the markets and the farm inputs and the private sector engagement and extension agents, such as Bedru was talking about. By the way, I used to be an extension agent in the middle of nowhere in Eritrea, so I have that experience. And so it's very important that we support policies that are, because if we put, for example, let's put irrigation sector in the middle of nowhere, where farmers don't have access to sell their products, or they don't have access to essential inputs such as seeds or integrated pest management and things like that. So make sure that we have that, our eyes on the ball is where I see our roles being like careful on putting our investment and our support there to think about. From a second perspective is that we need to continue supporting funding for research and development, such as the Feed the Future Innovation for Small-Scale Irrigation, the funding we presented through Murray, the Irrigation Fit for Purpose. I'm actually the Agreement Officer representative from IFPRI. We have a project on policy, evidence, analytics, research and learning, Pearl, which is actually I'm the Agreement Officer representative, where we're working with many different countries. But also, we also need to work on development focus, such as the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia and other things that we've done. And last but not least, one of the things we need to do is monitoring, evaluation, and learning, because we are a learning organization, so we utilize learning from yearly indicators through Feed the Future, and also through performance and impact evaluation to make decisions. So our role is to really to listen to implementers and experts such as you, and then help evidence-based decisions to actually do our programming. So that's where I see the role. The third part that I would say is that some of the things we need to think about is work with stakeholders, such as private sector engagement, through programs such as the Water and Energy for Food. This is a big one of our Grand Challenge programs that is funded through the Development, Democracy, and Innovation Bureau. And since Ku McMahon is not here, I'll put his words here in some way. So one of the things is to work with, we do work with USAID with many different agencies. So the Water Energy for Food Nexus is an 88 million USD international initiative that brings together the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, the European Union, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Government of Netherlands, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD, Sweden through the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, and of course USAID. So we do need to do from our side is not just do things alone, but also do it with other donors and stakeholders. So the way we've done it, for example, is the goal of the WF4, the Water Energy for Food, is to help innovations within the water, energy, food nexus, and impacts next to scale and impact smallholder farmers, women, and other end users. So when vulnerable communities have access to innovative technologies, they are able to produce more food while using less water energy. At least that's the goal. So innovation supports by this initiative contributes to not only productivity, but also to climate adaptation, mitigation, by reducing the usage of fossil fuels, for example, through solar irrigation. The program also uses a regional hub approach to provide innovators with technical assistance, grants, investment facilitation, and legal, regulatory, and policy support. So right now, the program works in 137 innovators, which 25 provide solar irrigation solutions in East Africa, West Africa, Middle East and North Africa, South and Southeast Asia, or Southern and Central Africa too. So private sector companies need three ways type of support to enable the scaling of their solar irrigation systems, for example. So they need technical assistance and partnership development and also investment facilitation. So Water and Energy for Food Nexus helps that. So along with the global food security strategy, we also have the Water Energy for Food Nexus and other examples that we, as a donor, try to do to help, achieve better food and water security. Thank you.
Thank you. And the Water Energy for Food hubs are fantastic. What they're doing, they are supporting young innovators. There's incubators, so it's very much driving those that can deliver on those policy agendas that governments have. So thank you for that, Binyam. So that finishes our first part of this session, and I want to ask Alaka Murray to remain on stage, but want to thank Binyam and Bedru for your inputs, and we're now going to ask Jude and Richard to join on stage. Thank you very much. So the second part of our session is we're going to look at the role of groundwater and irrigation actors. So we've talking about policies and the setting of the stage, but now we're going to really focus down on the actors for that. And Jude, you ready? So I'm happy to ask Jude, who's from Save the Children, to give us some remarks on groundwater and policies in the development context. Over to you, Jude.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. So, as I said before, I'm the guy from the non-profit, and I just want to bring us down back to four things to ground us in as we talk about this policy discussion. And The first is that in Africa we're in a food security crisis at the moment, and it's getting worse. We've got demographic and urbanization challenges that mean we have to radically ramp up food production. And the only way we're going to do that is with irrigation. And so the need for irrigation has never been higher, and it's going to get even higher as time goes on. The second thing to say is that particularly for smallholder farmers, most of that irrigation is going to be from groundwater. The good news on that one is that the lack of a resource is not a problem. Most African countries use less than 5% of their renewable, sustainable groundwater resource currently. So we could double, we could triple, we could quadruple groundwater-based irrigation in most African countries without harming the environment. That's the second point. The third point is, so if it's not water, what is the problem? Well, it's a complex interplay of what we used to call secondary factors, but these are really the primary bottlenecks on ramping up irrigation. The electricity supply, the road network, the cold storage chains, the access to banking and extension services, and a whole myriad of other factors which we hydrologists like to call secondary factors, but they're not. They're the real primary constraints here. So that's the third thing. And so the fourth thing that I wanted to say is, and this is an appeal to all of us here, so let's stop the crisis narrative of we're about to suck Africa dry. There's enough groundwater to ramp up irrigation. And let's tackle these secondary factors. Let's have a look at them and discuss what the bottlenecks are and how we can adopt them. And the third thing I wanted to mention as well is this distinction between farmer-led irrigation, the small-scale irrigation, and big ig and big ag. To me, I don't care who irrigates. I like both sides. There's a lot of things to be learned between them. Let's perhaps minimize those distinctions and join forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude, and thank you for stimulating our thinking across that. Richard, we welcome your insight. Maybe that's the big irrigation input from Valmont, but thank you, Richard.
Yes, you hear me? Okay. I've spent about 40 years of my career in selling irrigation equipment, and a lot of that time was spent in Africa. And I'd like to take my 2 minutes to show two pictures. And the first picture, which is up right now, I took about 30 years ago. And prior to that, I was connected with the internet. And Bob and I, who is out here in the audience, who was my boss for many years, we were talking about the internet and how that's going to change our way of doing business. And then soon after that, I get my first email from a customer, or a potential customer at the time. And he was a farmer from India. And he had a simple question for me. He said, "Can you grow vegetables under a pivot?" And I remember my answer to him. I said, if a plant will grow under rain, it will grow under a pivot. And then we started this dialogue, and he had this unique idea. He was living in Naivasha, Kenya, which is balanced on the equator, but about 7,000 foot in elevation. And he said, I have this idea of buying a pivot to grow vegetables for export to Europe, and I like to be able to harvest every day of the year. And I said, well, how are you going to do that? He said, I'm going to segment this pivot into about 12 sections, and I'm going to plant once a week, and I have about a 10-day window of harvest. And he was an outgrower to these big commercial vegetable growers, and he said, I can guarantee them a supply every day, 365 days of the year. And I said, that's a great idea. And he was a very poor farmer at the time, an outgrower, and we had to give him credit. We gave him credit just based on his idea. And this is his first pivot. And my next trip over, we got in a plane. Can you go back to it? we got in the plane and I took this picture. And he was trying to explain his idea, but my eyes saw something different. I said, gee, I've been thinking about this smallholder thing completely wrong all my life. I've wasted years trying to make small pivots for small farmers, and I was working against mathematics. Because one of the biggest advantages of a center pivot is pi r square. Now, if you can follow me, the pivot is the r in that equation. So you pay for the r, but you get the exponential benefit of area, the area of a circle. The bigger the pivot is, the cheaper it gets per hectare. And that's why you see so many pivots in Nebraska. But what I saw there is multiple farmers. The light went on in my head. Why am I working against mathematics trying to make small pivots when I can use a large pivot and just tackle the social issues of a cooperative sharing a pivot? Now the next picture, that's a satellite view of last year. And they were making, all these commercial farmers were making fun of my new customer, saying his idea was crazy. But you can see what they've done. They're doing exactly the same thing he pioneered 30 years ago. And again, I'd like to say these are all small farmers, but these are commercial operators using this concept. So I hope this plants some seeds in some people in this room about how we could utilize this technology for small farmers.
So thank you. We need to bring some maths to the policy processes and the policy thinking. Thank you, Richard. Okay, could I ask now to cue the video, please? So we're now going to have a video from Future Pump, which is a company that's concerned about water resource management and contributing to research on increasing access to water while also looking at sustainability. So thank you for the video.
Okay. It's an honor for me to be here to present to you what KREP is doing in regard to financing of the smallholder farmers to acquire solar water powered water pumps. I am Faith Wambogo.
Yeah. Well, it was a very good video. We could have watched it again, but let's try and get the Future Pump video. Make a test, yeah. It was testing us, wasn't it? To see if we were awake in the last one. That's what that test was. Yes, you do whichever one you want first. Oh, no, we can't. Molly, we can't. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, whilst we are looking at the videos, I'm going to ask some questions to the team, if that's all right. So, Jude, I'd like to ask you a question. As a hydrogeologist concerned with groundwater sources, what is needed for smallholder farmers to access the resource? What types of government policy and institutions or other actions are needed?
Great, there's a lot to that question. Thanks, Rachel. But
we've got a lot of time before the video comes.
But basically, this whole thing of these so-called secondary factors, to me, is something that needs to be solved. And I really would ask on research institutions that are here, we don't know enough about how they interact with each other and what the real bottlenecks are. So policymakers in Africa are aware of the need for ramping up irrigation, and there's a huge focus now on water and food security, and what we need now are practical things to do. And some of them are quite simple. I mean, it's scandalous that there are tariff and non-tariff barriers to the importation of pumps and irrigation equipment, for example. But others are much more complicated to do with things like currency fluctuations and how to hedge against that, and the role of the MDBs in assisting with those. So what I'm trying to say is a whole complex interplay of issues here which prevent a kind of green revolution takeoff at the moment in Africa, in my opinion. And we need to understand them better first, and then make policy recommendations going from there.
Thank you, Jude. Richard, you let us know how long you've been working in Africa, so we're not going to let you go without you telling us what's your takeaways and what can we take from that for the future of farming, smallholder farming in Africa.
Okay, well, the biggest issue, I think, is food security, or in Africa's case, the lack of food security. And I think there's a perfect storm brewing in Africa, and I think Jude made reference to that. With the current rate of population growth, with climate change, and the real lack of progress on yields in Africa, especially in the smallholder area, there's a perfect storm brewing. And it's going to be catastrophic if some very big moves don't take place real quickly. And the second one is, without a dramatic increase in irrigated hectareage in Africa, food security is unattainable in Africa. It has to increase. If you look at the world figures, about 20% of the cropland is irrigated. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's 5%. And that 20% produces 40% of the tonnage, or 50% of the value of the food crops. Africa has to do this to be food secure. And the two biggest problems is, one, the lack of commercial farming in Africa, and number two, the lack of groundwater use. Those are the biggest issues I see in food security.
So we have to think about the policies that, Jude, you were telling us we're using 5% of available groundwater, so we know it's economic water scarcity that's holding back those developments you're asking for, Richard. And we heard yesterday from Beth Ford that it's very much investment into water systems and water structures that's going to fuel that irrigation that's needed to get the additions of crops and yields from those crops. So
what's ironic is that Africa can use irrigation to the best benefit of any continent, but it's the least irrigated.
Okay.
It's a real shame.
So we need to bring that thinking into the policies as we're looking at those food security and water security policies. So thank you. Alok, can I ask you, from an Asian perspective, where groundwater resources are overexploited in some regions, what institutions should African countries adopt to make sure that there is that long-term sustainability? We know we have water there now, but we want that water there to also be there in 50 years' time.
Yeah, very good question. And as we know that in the South Asia is sucking something like close to 300 plus BCM of 1 billion cubic meter of water. And India alone is pumping over 250 plus. And as a result, although we are contributing 64% to the irrigated area in India and 60% in South Asia, but we have also created a situation which is aggravated to the extent that about 22% of our groundwater units, administrative blocks, are either overexploited or in a critical stage. And so that, based on that, one thing which I can suggest is, though our hydrogeologist was saying, yeah, it's only 5 or 6% of the groundwater is exploited, but there are still some areas, even in Africa, that particularly in about the northwestern Saharan or the Nubian aquifers, where there are under stress. So the first thing which I think, based on our lessons, which India has been now doing, a whole lot of that national aquifer mapping, even at high resolution, at least at low resolution, let the first of all that thing be taken up simultaneously in Africa, so that you know where are the critical hotspots, so where are the surpluses, so that then accordingly you can kind of build a future plan to use the groundwater the way you would like to. So that's one thing on the technology side. The second thing is on the demand management. Because as we are going forward, we have also learned that over a period of time, that now unless we go into the demand management, we just really can't do anything, because the supply side is always limited by the amount of the rainfall which you are having. So, and when we are looking into the demand side management, any kind of a natural resource, be it water or elsewhere, in case of this water, it has to be in a participatory approach. So another lesson which we have learned and is worth sharing is the participatory groundwater management. And now, over the years, whatever has been our learnings, the Government of India, with the World Bank support, has come up with, where IMI has contributed in the policy document, is Atal Bhujal Yojana. Atal is the name of the earlier Prime Minister, where we are doing participatory groundwater management is mapping of the area, building the water management plan for the district, and the community mobilization. And then you are looking into the disbursement is linked with certain indicators. And so that's the kind of the way that we have overcome and kind of gathered our experience learning. So that's something that I would like to suggest. And then the next thing is, number of areas, there are the farmers, we are very small holders. They even can't afford to have a pump or a well or a tube well. So in that case, either we have a business type of models like groundwater markets, or we also have what we call farmer collectives. Like even based on our own IME's experience working with the ACIR project, we have seen in the eastern part of the country that how best this kind of farmer collectives would work. Similarly, even our experience, which has now gone into the government policies also, that where we are seeing that how we can even have a solar irrigation pumps as a solar cooperatives, solar entrepreneurs, they become a service providers. So service provisioning of irrigation could be done like using a small pump, not too small, like 5 to 7.5 HP solar irrigation pump, and with the pipe network of, so that we do not waste water and we have more efficient. And that has really created a good amount of market, and it has become a win-win situation both for the young people and also for the farmers, because they are now getting the water from the water market at a much cheaper price as compared to what they will be getting when they are buying the water from a person who is selling water using the diesel irrigation pump set. So those are the kind of the few lessons. The other things is that no matter where we are, as of today in Africa, but in the long term, we have to look into the managed aquifer recharge. Because what we are withdrawing, we should try and also see that we go on doing the artificial recharging with any kind of a managed aquifer recharge or any kind of system. So that is another piece of learning that I think which really we have to look into account. And finally, the groundwater governance and the institutions. As I said, that in the form of local level institutions, what is the associations, or the way we try and look into. Now my final point, I know I might be running out of time, is that now that we are having all these sensor-based systems, I know that smallholders, we can't afford to have a sensor, but at the community at large, like our own experience in Africa has shown, where we have put chameleon sensors, and using that, the water user association have transmitted that information to the area, and that, based on that, when they are doing the irrigation scheduling, there has been around 20-25% of water saving. And not only that, also the fertilizer, efficient use of fertilizer. So I think I'll stop over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alok. And I do like those chameleon sensors. I don't know if you've seen them. You put them into the ground and they either say green, yellow, and red. So it doesn't matter what language you read. You know whether you need to irrigate or not irrigate. So it's something as simple as that, a technology. And Alok, you're saying that reduced by 25% the irrigation water input. So fantastically useful, simple device that can help there.
And we are using it right now, even in India. So
Don't you try and pull that EME, I'm going to speak longer thing. Okay. Murray, I would really love you to think about, we've been hearing so many reflections here. What do you think is needed in Africa for institutions to support sustainability?
Yeah, thank you. In terms of groundwater abstraction and use for irrigation, I will also want us to... Yeah, I will also want us to tread the path of caution. Good. People are saying the groundwater is there, Africa, but we have experience from India now. And there are technologies available, like you talk about these community-based sensors that you can use to monitor groundwater abstraction levels. And also there are this water scheduling, what you just mentioned now, on when to irrigate and how to irrigate. This should be brought on board. So even in Africa, groundwater is not only for irrigation. Most urban towns now in Africa, let me give an example, Ghana, Nigeria, they are abstracting groundwater for potable water. So the demand has to be managed, and I think he stressed that. Especially where the institutions are weak, where the public institutions are weak, there's a need to tread the path of caution. good smallholders, they can irrigate, but with simple technology, we can monitor what is happening and regulate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Muriel, and what a fantastic set of insights on groundwater, both the possibilities and those tales of cautionary. Are we ready with the video? Okay, we're going to go with the video. So this is the video from Future Pump and looking at a company's view on contributing to research on water resources management. Thank you.
So what are some of the potential ways that we can ensure that groundwater is used sustainably? Well, the reality is, if you're going to make irrigation more accessible to more people, then it's very likely that you are going to increase the amount of water that's extracted from the ground. If we decide that we should improve and increase irrigation, which I think we agree is beneficial to millions of small-scale farmers and the food security of whole nations, then it needs to be well managed. So we need to ensure that this increase of irrigation is done in combination with farming practices that enable the most efficient use of water. Before we even mention complex and high-tech things such as drought-resistant seeds and more expensive interventions, there are some simple actions that we should be encouraging all farmers to be doing. So there's mulching with organic matter around plants, which helps to reduce the evaporation from the soil and also increases the organic matter in soils, which helps retain more water. We should encourage people to avoid hit and miss watering, so just spraying water willy-nilly around the fields, and we should be targeting irrigation to hit directly at the roots of plants and at the best times of day for irrigation to reduce the evaporation that immediately can happen after it hits the ground. You want it to be able to soak in. You also want to avoid overwatering. So where certain pumps, maybe petrol pumps, encourage flooding the land with lots of water, water then sits on the surface of the land and is there able to evaporate before it goes into the soil again. So you want to avoid overwatering and maintaining pumps so that they're not leaking water in places that it's not needed, and generally making the most efficient use of the water that's there. At Future Pump, we have remote monitoring on thousands of our pump units, and these are monitoring when people are using pumps and when they're irrigating and where they are. So there is potential for this data to be used in a way that can also help out, because you can't monitor what you can't measure. And if you've ever tried to get valid data of what is actually being extracted from small-scale farmers around the world, there are no data sets at the moment that you would feel confident in knowing that you had that answer. So the more data that can be collected and analysed so that we know the problem that we are dealing with, or the potential problem that we're dealing with, the better. So if more work can be done to monitor, measure, and then identify solutions or target areas for being more careful with groundwater extraction, then that could be extremely useful going forward.
So thank you for that. So that's our second part of this session, and where we've looked at groundwater, and I'm sure you'd like to thank the panelists for that. Thank you. Jude, you go. So we're now going to ask Nicole to join us on stage, and we're now going to talk about, Murray, something you just mentioned. It's about water's used by many different users. So we're going to look at multi-use water strategies, and particularly focusing on nutrition and health. And Nicole, I'd like you to give us some opening remarks on gender nutrition and multiple use pathways.
Great, yeah, thank you. So I'll start by saying that this research was done under the Innovation Lab for Small-Scale Irrigation, which was supported by USAID for 10 years. And that's important because it meant that we were able to do longitudinal studies. And under the Innovation Lab, IFPRI was able to show a link between small-scale irrigators, so the households that irrigated, and nutritional outcomes. And what we found was improved household dietary diversity, improved women's dietary diversity, reduced wasting of children, and improved height for weight scores, or Z-scores, which is basically a measurement of child growth. In addition to being able to show that link between improved nutrition, they were able to look at the pathways. So we see there's irrigating household, we see these improvements. What is the link? And they identified multiple pathways between nutrition and irrigation. One of them is improved income, where households made more money and spent that money on nutritious foods. Some household consumption, where households consumed part of what they grew. Improved water access, women's empowerment, and some other pathways. And it's important to note that pathways are very contextual. So the pathways that we identified in Tanzania were different from those in Ethiopia, in Ghana, and Mali. And it's also not singular. For example, in northern Ghana, we found that income is important, but so was household consumption. So you might use your income to purchase cattle or chickens, which then improved household dietary diversity and protein intake. So pathways both rely on where you're at, but also they can be multiple at the same time. And really the message from this for policy is that irrigation investments are nutrition investments. So if you want to have an improved nutritional outcome, irrigation is one of your options for investment. And there's a way of thinking about this as reorienting from what we used to say more crop per drop to now more nutrition per drop. So really shifting our thinking about irrigation investments as increasing nutritional outcomes as opposed to just increasing calories, as has been the case in a lot of the past schemes.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for broadening the thinking about the outcomes for policies beyond just the number, what ton or hectare per ton per hectare is them. Ju, can you give us a little bit of insight from Save the Children's view on multiple use services and outcomes?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Rachel. I'll explain just what a multiple use service is. From our point of view at SAVE, we've just finished some research in Zimbabwe on these systems, and essentially, it's using a single water source for both water, sanitation, hygiene for domestic use and for productive uses, and combining them together. And the kind of simple takeaway of the moose approach, as we call it, is that you need to plan that from the beginning. You need to know that the pump that you're putting in, even if you only plan it for domestic use, is going to be used for other uses in the household and on the property as well. So you might as well plan that from the beginning, whether that means a higher yield, a more robust pump, water quality concerns, and then also concerns that come from the land use changes that might occur when you start to use that water for productive purposes, depending on what those are. So there's a whole bunch of things that should be considered, and essentially, if we consider them at the planning stage, we can facilitate the use of multiple use water systems, which has huge myriad benefits, as you were saying, and if we don't consider them, we run into those problems anyway. So that's really all that we mean by that, and I'll be quiet there, actually, Rachel.
Thanks, Jude. So, Nicole, you've opened up our thinking. You're looking at different pathways in the intersect. We've got gender and nutrition in multiple ways. So how can we help those pathways intersect and to bring benefits such as women's empowerment, nutrition, and health?
Right. So I wanted to reflect just for a moment on the multiple use services. I think, as Muriel said, we really are reliant in a lot of African countries on groundwater for drinking water as well. And a lot of water systems end up being used for multiple services. But we need to have that deliberate planning and deliberate, the technology planning, but as well as the use planning and water quality is really important to that intersection of health and water resource development. And one of the things that we found was that even though increasing access to water generally is one of the potential pathways of irrigation to nutrition, in itself it's not enough. So we found that even where water increased and people use that water for multiple uses of domestic uses, for preparing food, for wash reasons, the sanitation didn't actually improve. So in and of itself, increasing access to water didn't really move the needle on nutrition. And really the message from that is, you can call it bundling, as some institutions do now, but essentially thinking in terms of not just introducing a technology, but what is the type of information people need for that? If you know that they're going to use it for multiple purposes, should you also be providing information and training around things like, you know, sanitation uses of it, safe water uses, concerns about water quality? Because in and of itself, just increasing water access doesn't not necessarily improve the health outcomes. So that's one area where you could have interventions through policy support.
So it's looking at the whole water system environment, and in the CGIR we're looking at science to transform food, land and water systems in a climate crisis, and we really can't just focus in WIMP because of the interconnectedness, the feedbacks, the collateral damage, whatever it might be in those system thinking. Unless we think in systems, we have all sorts of unintended consequences to our policies. Jude, can I ask you, just catching up here, can multi-use water schemes grow the effectiveness of irrigation and wash interventions, or is competition between these two water uses making things more difficult?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it has made things more difficult sometimes in the past. There have been two kind of competing paradigms. But of course they can. Of course, if we plan it effectively together, we can get the benefits of both and save on a bunch of money at the same time. So it all depends on how we plan it and what we do. And I'll make the point again that, you know, whilst of course the water resource is important, we find it's often not the key constraint on these systems. That's something else. It's often financial sustainability, or it might be a market for the produce, or a whole bunch of other things. In amongst all of these so-called secondary factors, the primary water resource is much less often the key constraint.
Thank you, Jude. And Mark, in his keynote today, was talking about fragmentation, and we have to get across those boundaries and barriers, and we really have to think as a water system if we're going to really bring the changes that climate change is going to demand that we have for our water parts of that system and those water services. We're now going to ask for a video, and this is going to be a video by Wendy Jepson, and it's drawing attention to the intersectionality of water security and food security. So cue the video.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Jepson. I'm a university professor in the Department of Geography at Texas A&M University. I also am Associate Director for Research at the Texas Water Resources Institute at Texas A&M AgriLife. There are two questions that I've been asked to address today. The first question is, water and food security and nutrition security are interlinked. To understand these linkages, however, we need to be able to measure water security. What methods and tools exist for this? And can you describe a sample application? So first, I want to talk about how we define water insecurity. Household water insecurity is not only access to safe water, but it relates to affordability, adequacy, reliability, and safety for all water needs, including biophysical, cultural needs, and social requirements. Household water insecurity incorporates the interacting and co-present cumulative physical and psychosocial experiences related to water. Such an approach requires then that we analytically recenter our work to assess and measure various aspects or dimensions of water insecurity beyond water quality and water quantity or access. So researchers have developed new metrics to assess water insecurity experiences in ways that helps us explain and understand the foundational impact it has on many aspects of human development and well-being. A straightforward way to measure this is using the HY scale, the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Scale, along with other validated metrics, like the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, HFIAS. With these metrics, researchers have been able to empirically test the relationship between water and food insecurity. In one study, it was established that as household water quantity and quality decrease, food insecurity increases. In addition, the same study determined that experiences of water insecurity also force people to change what they're eating. There are, as I mentioned earlier, the HY scale. It is a 12-item scale. We also have the HY's 4 that has 4 items, both of which are available to use to assess water insecurity. And as many of you know, there are several other opportunities and options for assessing food insecurity. The second question is as follows. What is the role of multiple use water services in addressing water and food security jointly? Across lower and middle income countries, households and communities have drawn on the same water source for multiple purposes, whether for drinking, washing, cooking, livestock raising, or irrigating. Using single water sources for multiple uses is not new, but in recent decades, international development agencies have attempted to standardize and scale up what we call MUS, multiple use systems, within a broader integrated water development paradigm. Not all MUS systems, however, are equal in terms of how to address water and food insecurity. So I want to briefly summarize the types and then return back to the question of food, nutrition, water security nexus. There are 2 basic MUS modalities, irrigation plus and domestic plus. These 2 types are part of local practices, which we would call de facto MUS, or by design, often integrated as parts of larger development initiatives. Domestic plus services provide water primarily for domestic use while providing sufficient resources for productive activities at the homestead or the household, such as home gardens, livestock, and home-based enterprises. Domestic plus services take on various forms. A domestic plus system could include a single piped rural water supply system sized and designed to serve both domestic and productive uses at the homestead. In addition, domestic standpipes may also provide water to multiple homesteads co-located with productive uses such as communal gardens, cattle troughs, or small-scale industries. The second modality is irrigation plus. Water resource managers set priorities for irrigated water agriculture, while non-irrigation uses are, at the very least, tolerated or even supported. Through irrigation plus, the prioritization of water for crops is maintained, but not at the exclusion of other uses. So, the ability to enhance co-benefits of food and water depend on MUS system configuration, whether it's domestic plus or irrigation plus. So let me explain. Increased domestic water access holds the potential to improve nutrition. This mechanism can apply to both domestic plus or irrigation plus. Home gardens can be created when there's greater availability of water, primarily for domestic use. This dynamic also potentially enhances increased dietary diversity. As activities go beyond subsistence agriculture to income generation, this increased water supply can also improve economic activity with the expected indirect benefits that include increased food security and resources to invest in other nutrition and preventative health interventions. Evidence in Senegal, for example, describes how women using water in domestic plus systems were able to grow a variety of crops which were both sold in local markets and saved for home consumption. This extra income contributes to household food security during lean months, while also providing vegetables that are lacking in local diets. Another study in Nepal demonstrated that upgraded or newly installed drinking water systems reduced the time women spent fetching water for domestic purposes, while also supporting women's productive engagement in vegetable farming. But the caveat is as follows. Nutritional benefits in irrigation plus systems are compromised or at risk because of the challenge of water quality. Looking at the recent research in these systems, water quality could undermine possible health or nutrition benefits that would normally be expected with increased water availability. And this is specifically related to irrigation plus systems. In fact, water quality risks are high in irrigation plus systems. Irrigation water is not treated to accommodate human use. Domestic use of irrigation water increases the potential health risks by increasing exposure pathways to pathogens, E. coli, and agrochemicals. Untreated irrigation water may transmit fecal oral diseases such as diarrhea, dysentery, or hepatitis. Thus, poor quality or contaminated irrigation water undermines the potential health and nutritional benefits of increased water availability. And this is evident in the empirical case studies and research. Therefore, any irrigation plus MUS system must acknowledge that irrigation water will not be suitable for human consumption and include some form of and require some form of water treatment. For example, household level chlorination or filtration if human consumption is to be considered. These systems will add capital cost and generate a maintenance burden. But even that said, this additional cost, which may not be small, is likely lower than the cost of developing a separate drinking water system. So moving forward, there are pathways to leverage the positive linkages between food, water, and nutrition security within and across both agricultural and wash services within a multiple use water regime. However, as previously noted, water quality would have to be directly addressed. Next generation investment in MUS, multiple use systems, needs to develop critical supply chain capacity building and maintenance regimes to support novel technology packages to improve water quality. Water quality is the major weakness of Irrigation Plus, as I've said. And as discussed, any benefits of increasing that water availability can be quickly eroded if water quality is not reached and maintained. To that end, there are opportunities to leverage novel technologies, solar nanotechnology, water filtration and purification, and ICT in ways that address the major vulnerability of MUS. As prior research has demonstrated, MUS in general generates economic benefits and thus establishes a willingness to pay for water improvements that may provide sustainable opportunities to achieve overall water security and nutrition outcomes. While it is beyond the scope of this session to discuss those in details, there's a full range of engineering configurations of solar-driven water filtration systems, for example, that can potentially support multiple use water in lower middle income countries and in ways that enhance the benefits of multiple use water, increasing water access and overcoming the barriers, which is water quality. Thank you.
Thank you. So Wendy was essentially saying, as we're developing those pathways and policies for small-scale irrigation, let's include some multiple-use thinking in it. Let's put some water quality management so that water can be used for human consumption and human use. So again, broadening our thinking around this. We have time for, I think, one question. So one question here from the audience. Lacey, are there any coming in? Oh, that's good. We'll have one question here, and it's to any of the speakers that are for that.
If you so choose.
Yes, please, you.
I love the solutions in this room. All that you guys do is nothing short of amazing.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
I have to walk over here. This is a wheel.
Oh, golly.
It's been rolling in Africa for 32 years. It's made out of Johannesburg. Polyethylene, stainless steel, lasts for 5 to 11 years. Distributed in 57 countries, 65,000 units. No one's ever heard of it. Okay? I'm asking this room, I'm begging this room, to look at the Hippo roller and find ways, because it's gravity-fed irrigation. It's the beginning of more water, more crops. You have to start somewhere. So this is your little incubator Easter egg. Please, if you can find it in your heart and in your world to incorporate your stories with this, I would love it. I discovered these guys 2.5 years ago. I used GIS science, so I can show you within 6 feet of every Hippo roller that was deployed in the world. So you can feel where it's going. You'll see 4 rivers around the communities, and you realize some of them don't have a water problem, they have a water portability problem. This is what you guys do. You do water portability.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? If not, then please, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Richard and Bob, it's a question for you, sorry, Valmont Valley. So my question is related to hydrogen technologies, because in Namibia, in Africa, there's a big investment, $50 billion to produce hydrogen. In Central Asia also, $50 billion to produce hydrogen. And also in Nebraska, $1 billion investment to set up a hydrogen hub. So, and Valmont Valley, are you planning to be in line of these activities, maybe to use hydrogen, to put this some kind of engine, and maybe to provide some training, technical vocational training related to hydrogen and how to apply it, yeah.
It's a green energy, Richard. Green energy such as hydrogen.
I'm not an expert, but I'm not aware, I'm retired from Valmont, but I'm not aware of anything that Valmont is doing on hydrogen. But I've studied hydrogen a little bit, and I see that there's potential in the long run for it to substitute for carbon-producing fuels, and that there's a lot of excitement about it. There are ways to transform it to produce ammonia, and thereby have safe portability for it. So people in Chile and people in Australia are investing billions, like you say, in facilities that would produce the ammonia, which could then be shipped to places like Japan that don't have domestic energy supplies or hydroelectric and things like that. So it's an emerging technology. There are a number of different paths that people are pursuing. If you go to the internet, you can find YouTube videos of people saying that it will never work, and very nicely done, and then other videos that say it's the future. Now I've told you a little bit more than I know, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob. So thank you very much for everybody. Murray, we really appreciated your insight on Africa and the thinking you're already bringing from the African Union into how policies and pathways can both protect but also support water and small-scale irrigation there. Alok, we always appreciate your insight and the depth of your knowledge from India and the way you share so much from the learnings there. Bedru, we really want the results of your that impact assessments of those tariffs and those changes in policies that were there. Biniam, I think, might have gone, but USAID supporting ILSI for 10, 11 years. USAID thinking. Biniam, thank you for having a donor to really support a project and a program to bring the results that is needed to make a big difference beyond the 3 years. That's really important. Jude, having that input from you challenge us, but also bring the NGO, the Save the Children, such an important organization for that. And Valmont, we know it was great to see the photographs and the change that those pivotal irrigation can do, but you're also challenging us to think differently about what smallholder irrigation might look like. And Nicole, your leadership of both ILSI, but also in our thinking and making us think about diversity and inclusion. That's really important. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for joining us, and for those online. We know there's lots of fantastic sessions here, but we've really enjoyed you being here and for listening. I want to thank the audiovisual and for getting the everything up and running for us. Thank Lacey for online, and the brilliant Molly Nance for ensuring our 2 sessions really came off and has managed everything. So thank you, Molly, for being with us. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for being with us.